Bring pop if we
Yeah,
wanted
open
to,
it up.
but
Yeah,
if we
maybe.
have to.
Yeah.
The original.
Yeah.
Where's Carl?
It's not gonna be as long
I'm not fixing anything. When was that due? Maybe we can go to grocery after that. That's not what it was it? But
That's the tune. It looked beyond my faults.
That's good. I like the title. Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Susan.
The announcements are that we are having lunch, dinner, whatever, at 6 o'clock on Wednesday, and we're having pizza, salads, fruit salads, desserts, chips, that kind of stuff. So come, and it's a back-to-school night, so if you need back-to-school products, your mother hasn't had time to go get you anything yet. She's done some things here.
We made that happen.
You did it yesterday? Wow. All right. Yearly meeting is next week. There are sessions all during the week, and there's a schedule back there at the back. At 9:30 Sunday morning, they're having a song fest. Is that better, Barbara Jane, instead of hymns?
Yes.
Okay, there you go. And at 10 o'clock then is the service at Western Yearly Meeting, and we are not going to have an organized meeting here. If you want to come here, the doors will be open. You can come and meditate on your own, but there will not be a formal service. We'll either be in bed down to sleep still, or we'll be at yearly meeting. So, what else was there to announce? That was it, okay. Nothing else to announce. Okay, let's go to prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, as we come to you today, we look for guidance, we look for peace, we look for hope. And most of all, we hope for love from each other, and we know we have love from you. Be with us today as we settle ourselves down, center our attention on your word, and listen with our hearts, not just our ears, so that we might be better stewards of your love to those in our world. Amen. What do you want to play? You are the center of attention, and you didn't have to fall down to do it.
What about What a Friend?
I like that. Find 6:30. 6:30. Boy gets bragging rights. She's down to first. Would you like to stand as we sing this exercise?
It's a good story.
Really good choice. Thank
Hi,
you.
Toby.
Would you like to take hands with those around you?
Morning.
Welcome everyone this morning. Okay, then just stay there.
Yeah. I'm great. Awesome. Nice to meet you. Yeah.
Hi.
Morning, Cliff.
Hi.
Missed you last week.
Yes, we worked it there. Yeah.
How are you? Morning, Bill.
Too tight to see you in the mirror.
Morning.
You're right. He doesn't deserve it today. Aw, my favorite.
What are you on? Coffee.
Well, like, we're here. We're here.
I'm on today. It was a good week.
My name is Kate.
That's what counts.
I like
Don't do
Thursday.
anything on
I
Thursday.
like Thursday. The order.
How are you?
Okay.
Yes.
But I'm glad to go on Thursday.
Morning.
Yeah.
And all around, there was only maybe 100 people there.
Bill.
Yeah.
Hey, Jessica. How are you?
I guess I have it.
Morning.
Last night, there was 2,700.
Hey, Dave.
How was your vacation Bible school?
So are you living in the area?
Good morning, sir.
I was, being
School this week?
Okay.
No,
So medium.
I'm not.
medium.
Avon is.
So I had my
Because it was like some week.
Avon starts Thursday.
The next time.
I don't know when they start. I'm on Cascade.
At least you don't learn someplace.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
No, back then.
That's true.
You got to the point where we were like, everybody would each out. And we had to run.
Oh, yeah. When does that?
Good morning. How are you doing?
Sun carrying Perry.
Well, the bus will pick her up. He doesn't.
Yeah, I just put her out there.
He just sits her out there every morning from 7 to 9, and then she comes back in at 9. School hasn't started yet.
Thank God.
That's
that
Mary
helps
is
every
department.
time. I said she smelled good. Shower.
I don't know.
If you need a place
seems
to
like-
go.
I don't know.
We'll ask Violet. We'll ask Violet. when she
Yeah.
comes back.
That's always a good
It's not
thing
this
to
week,
do.
is it?
I know.
Once a month.
I was in the wash tracks all week. Why do I need to shower? My kids aren't very good at spraying the cows. They just spray each other.
You don't pick your nose in front of
Not yet.
Now you've met Uncle Bill. Okay, we have a request of page 40 in the blue binder. Mansion over the hillside. Hilltop. let everyone know, if they haven't already heard, Debbie Wicker's father passed away day before yesterday, real early in the morning. So our prayers with all of that family. Also for such a successful fair and such turned out to be pretty good weather after the storms blew through and left all the humidity in the room or in the building. First responders, our healthcare workers, police, all those people who keep us safe, and our leaders, as Toby always remembers. Now your turn.
Cody Cooper, he's had the trach taken out and he seems to be doing well with that. The house is in the process of nearing completion as far as getting it ready for him to go home. And,
Good.
yeah, so I mean, I know lots of prayers are gonna be needed. I mean, there's a long way of
Recovery.
Continued prayers for Mickey. I know he had a blood test this week, but I haven't heard the results.
And Nancy. We send our prayers to Nancy, but also to Bill, the caretaker. And Janet was able to make it to the fair at least 2 days, I think.
And she's at Putnam County today.
Oh, okay.
Mrs. White had her second chemo treatment and she didn't have any side effects this time around, so
Good.
that's good.
Pray for the truth.
Pardon me?
The truth?
Troops.
Troops, I thought you said
The truth.
truth.
The truth.
No, the truth.
Oh, the truth.
I didn't want to put that next to leaders.
They just, the leaders with truth.
I know Avon goes back to school this week.
Quinn's Cascade go back.
The fourth.
Greg, they go back to fourth.
Right, they go back and forth. Yeah. Probably take supplies in on the third, just saying.
And there are always unspoken prayers that we all have, that we're just not willing or able to talk about. So let's help us remember that God's right there with you when you have those concerns and issues. Okay, let's go to prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, as you listen to our prayers, you know them before we speak them, but we feel better verbalizing and making sure that we remember to praise those who respond to the situations that most of us run away from, that they're running into daily, and don't think twice about doing it. Those first responders, the teachers that walk into a classroom, the healthcare workers who take care of us and provide for us. But we also want to lift up Cody Cooper and his recovery and make it go smoothly and quickly so that he might be restored. But be with Mickey as he also undergoes health issues. Be with Nancy and Bill and Janet as they continue to recover and take care of each other. Be with Mrs. White and give her continued good results from tests or from treatments. And we are grateful that there are people who will step up and be leaders in our communities, but also give us the wisdom to support them, to praise them, and help them when they need help also. Be with Debbie Wicker's her whole family as they mourn the loss of her father. And be with those school kids and teachers as they go back to school. And parents. Help those parents know that they are the main teacher that every child has. Not in the classroom maybe, but they are teachers by their actions. And we all have unspoken prayers that we just don't want to verbalize or can't verbalize. There aren't words for maybe sometimes, but be with us and help us understand your works and your actions and how we might help you. Amen. Jesse, are you up? He's a double-fisted drinker today.
Water and coffee.
Water and coffee, it's gonna make it through.
Do you know what they were in
Good morning.
for?
Didn't know I was up until this morning, right before we walked out the door, so.
And you're well prepared.
Exactly. So I thought about it, I was like, okay, what can I talk about? And I should do something back to school, but I haven't accepted the fact that I'm going back to school yet. I don't want to.
I don't blame you.
So I had to deal with enough school stuff this week. I'm like, I don't want to deal with that yet. So I tried to look up a devotional that was surrounded by like ag or 4-H or something, which actually led me to the Dairyman. And it's called "So God Made a 4-H Member." And it's one of those things where I had football practice this week, and people are like, "Why do you go out there and hang out all day?" I was like, I don't know, but it is a blast, and it just fills you up all year. And Nathan and I were talking yesterday. Nathan's like, "I am ready to be done." He's like, "It was a fantastic week, but I am ready to be done." And I'm like, and then we're gonna get to the middle of June, and you're like, "Man, I can't wait to do it again." It's like, oh, exactly. And so it's just one of those things that's so weird where if you're not involved in it, you don't get it, but when you do it, you get it. And so this is called "So God Made a 4-H Member." It's based off the "So God Made a Farmer." God looked down on the earth that he had created and said, "I need someone who will keep the agriculture industry growing for years to come." So God made a 4-H member. God said, "I need someone who will work all year getting their steers, sheep, and pigs ready for show day that won't even last 10 minutes, and some not even the entire day." So God made a 4-H member. "I need someone who will have the leadership skills to run a meeting at an extremely young age. Someone who knows the Pledge of Allegiance and the 4-H pledge like the back of their hand. Someone you can count on to finish the job they have started, even if it means staying super late and way longer than ever planned." So God made a 4-H member. God said, "I need somebody to teach the public about the wonderful things that agriculture can provide us. Someone who will teach young children let young children pet their calf to grow the love of agriculture at the fair. Someone who will volunteer to help their community anytime they get a chance. Someone who knows that there will always be a bright future of agriculture, because without it, we will be extremely hungry." So God made a 4-H member. God had to have someone who can have fun when given a deck of cards and a bale of hay, and someone who can be best friends with the toughest competitors. So God made a 4-H member. God said, "I need someone who knows how to deal with hard work, pain, and sweat for long enough to finish the last load of hay and still push through until all the chores are done." So God made a 4-H member. It had to be someone that had a passion for livestock and beyond. Someone who can sew, cook, show, take pictures, plant crops, care for animals, make things out of wood, bake, write, knit, volunteer, fix problems, solve problems, and still have fun in the process. Somebody who will be able to handle not getting first, because at the end of the day, it isn't about the number of trophies or the ribbons you have. It's about the friendships and the memories that will last a lifetime. So God made a 4-H member.
I'm so thankful for the organization.
Good morning. You're gonna have to excuse me, I may have to put my glasses on and off and move my sheets because my printer and computer had a relationship problem.
I know the feeling.
And you know, as a counsel, I sat down, I asked them how they felt about each other. And they didn't fix it. I must have the wrong set of skills. Okay, I'd like to read some verses. Luke 12:48. For everyone who has given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who's been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. That verse is probably the most challenging and terrifying verse in the Bible for me. And I started thinking about it. And then in Romans 4:13, therefore let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's or sister's way. In Isaiah 57:14, and it will be said, build up, prepare the way, remove every obstacle out of the way of my people. So the other day, I went out on the patio, wanted to relax, breathe in a little outdoor air, and before I knew it, I was surrounded by a group of birds, squirrels, and chipmunks, and they were not happy. Their unhappiness was directed toward me. There was a few minutes of awkward silence. It seems they were waiting for me to do something. I had no idea what it might be. They looked like they were angrily anticipating me to do something, but I didn't know why. So, after a brief period and my growing uneasiness, Squirrel stepped forward with his fur standing up and his tail flipping in anger. He looked me in the eye. You are in charge here. You set the rules. You tell us to cooperate, be kind, think of others, right? Clearly that was a trick question. I knew it was a trick question. I knew that anything I said I was going to be in trouble. So I just sort of tried to, you know how you sort of nod hoping that it'll just go away? And it didn't. Because Squirrel said, yeah, but the other day, a cat brutally killed Chipmunk, leaving a wife and 2 pups. And you, yes, you. We could see you. We could see you, and you were happy. Now, that takes a little bit of explaining. This chipmunk loves seeds. And so I could do a whole row of snow peas, and 2 weeks later, there's no snow peas because a chipmunk had gone down the row and eaten every one. So, so then all of a sudden, they were gone. And really, there was sort of this stench of hypocrisy left in the air that I needed to look at rather carefully. And so I reflected on that. Because here was the chipmunk that really didn't need to be brutally killed, and I was sort of gloating over that. And it gets worse because a few days later I began seeing this cat posters for the cat that's missing, and there's some ironic justice here because of fox product. We had foxes that lived. And then I had to think, but you could easily see that the posters were made by children and they were missing their cat. And my gloating was once again inappropriate. So, I do make the rules. So it got me to thinking about what's the responsibilities for those who make the rules? For those who identify the sins, who says this is a sin and this isn't a sin. Because we usually don't think about that. We usually think about, you've done sin, right? That's our general approach. But I began reflecting on that. And in fact, you know, a lot of times we really sort of depend on Romans 6:23, the wages of sin, death, and we solemnly point that out to the transgressors. But what is, and in this case, my responsibility when someone else has sinned? What's my responsibility when I condemn someone else? Besides being self-righteous. That's the easy part. The other side is, the Bible clearly says some things are not good, and there are things we shouldn't do. So how do we sort of balance that out? Identifying, looking, understanding others' sins. So there was like 3 things that sort of wound around. And so I'd just like to talk about them. I don't know if it's a solution to this, but it's just sort of thoughts to think about. The first one was, take the Bible seriously, but don't take your interpretation of the Bible too seriously. Now, when you think of that, there's 2 groups of people I think of that are sort of the extreme. I have some friends. In fact, I have a friend who said, in a large group of people, I hate the Bible. Which is an interpretation of the Bible. The interpretation being, it's irrelevant. I'm not sure that's really the way to go. And often, in fact, I have several friends who sort of have this in different degrees. A lot of them then follow that with something about all the harm that's occurred. Some who say, all that violence in the Old Testament, I just don't understand it. I don't want to read about that. And then a few who say, I had the Bible crammed down my throat as a kid. And I'm going to say I was one of those kids, because I was raised in very fundamentals. But you know, at least in my thinking, I went through a lot of stages. I went through some stages where I was pretty hostile toward the Bible. I was pretty hostile toward myself at the same time. They probably went together. But then I sort of got to a point where I said, I'm not going to let those people steal the Bible away from me. And so I'm going to do it, and I'm going to take responsibility to look at it. So that's one sort of extreme that can happen. And the other one is those who believe in literal translations of the Bible. And I believe those people are good Christians. But literal translations of the Bible does have some problems. For instance, the genealogy of Christ in Matthew is completely then different than the genealogy of Christ in Luke. So if you take them literally, they contradict each other. Paul clearly thought that the second coming was going to occur during his lifetime. We're here. Obviously, that wasn't right. And then you get into translation problems. And I'm going to say this, I'm not trying to convince anyone of any side on this particular issue. But the word in Paul's letters that's translated as homosexual, that word exists in nowhere else except in Paul's writing. It's a word Paul made up. He took 2 words, bed and man, and put them together. Nobody knows what that word means. No one can say with 100% surety they know exactly that. And in fact, that word was translated very differently starting in the late 1800s, and it was translated as homosexual only more after that 1800s, according to some authors. So then when people try to translate that word, say, well, okay, so what's the culture? And that's a very, very complex thing to go back to and try and understand. So that's just an illustration of our interpretation is always our interpretation. So we should be careful. We should take the Bible seriously, study it, and try and understand it. But we really ought to be careful taking our interpretation, especially when it comes to identifying sins for other people. We should be a little cautious with that. The second issue is, I think we need to be honest about the damage religion has done to the world. It's not always a pleasant thing to think about. In fact, I have an atheist friend who just loves to bring that up. And, you know, not that I'm real subtle, but, you know, there's also been a few atheists that had some issues, you know, guys named Lenin, Stalin, Mao. And then, of course, for the female side, Ayn Rand, who I could probably talk about for hours. She once wrote a essay about Christ as a weakling, a despicable weakling. And another essay about how wonderful it was that this guy took his own personal liberty and raped somebody. But yet she's widely read. And people don't look at those essays that she wrote. But the other side is, we do need to look at it. Churches and religions have done an incredible amount of harm. Most of the time, when we decide to define what sin is for other people. You know, short list. The Bible is used extensively to protect and justify enslavement. Some of that's actually creeping back into our everyday world, that sort of thinking. A lot of wars were fought over interpretation of the Bible. In fact, the Quakers grew out of a time where having wars over the Bible was just sort of what was happening in the 1600s, 1700s. Calvin and all those people. I have dealt a number of times with congregations who wanted to excuse the behavior of pastors and youth pastors who have sexually abused kids. I've been in that situation both personally and professionally. I've worked in a lot of situations where congregations and ministers have told me that when I told a guy he can't hit his wife, that I was interfering with the sanctity of marriage. That still goes on. I've dealt with that recently. I remember this one case I worked with. It's always really stuck with me. I was working with a woman, and she had been sexually abused as a child, but she came to me because she had been shunned by her church. And she was pretty upset and depressed about it. And she and her husband were having marital problems. She went to her minister for counseling, and he ended up seducing her. The congregation's response to that was it was her fault. Yeah. And they shunned her, literally shunned her, not just in the church, in the entire community. You know, this church was really this woman's life. So, wielding the rod that defines sin can be a very powerful tool. Several denominations, including Quakers, decided that the American Indian culture was not good, uncivilized, barbaric. So we took the kids out of those homes, put them in boarding schools, and abused them. And so we need to face our history when religions become too convinced that we can sort of run the show based on our own view of what sin is. Okay, so those are two things. The third one, I think, is a really hard one to think about. And that's one where when we start thinking about sin and we say, it's just a choice, or people choose to sin. The word jest, just as an adverb, jest has 5 different definitions. And then there's 2 more using it as an adjective that I found. When someone says it was just a decision, you just made that choice, that's used as an adverb, and the definition really means simply, only, no more than. But I think it's interesting that, of course, just and justice go together. And justice can mean appropriate to the circumstances. One way to conceptualize choice is understand the circumstances that strongly influence choice. So, when you think about this, those 3 verses I think are important. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or stumbling block in a brother's way or sister's way. And the Isaiah went, build up, prepare the way, remove every obstacle out of the way of my people. And from everyone who's been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who's been entrusted with much, much will be asked. So the choice, okay, so it's a choice, but what do we do about the stumbling blocks? What's our responsibility to help other people when they have stumbling blocks that creates these times where they make sometimes some pretty bad decisions? So we need to reflect upon whether we use the words choice in a very casual and habitual way. And that we aren't thinking about the stumbling blocks that led people to those particular choices. And not understanding maybe where they're coming from. I had a young man give me a lesson on this once. I'm talking to him in a therapy session, and my plan was to talk to him about the physical abuse by his stepfather. So I began talking about that, and he sort of laughs at me. I have learned working with adolescents, when they laugh at you, that's probably something important is going to be said next. He says, my stepdad didn't physically abuse me because he only used his fists. Now my dad, he used a 2x4. That's abuse. And yeah, that's, wow. There's a lot of information to unpack in what that kid said. The clinical team that I was working at this point, when we talked about it, what we began doing is using a violence thermometer. So we began working with these kids. We had this thermometer that went from disagreeing to verbal disagreements to shouting to yelling, and went all the way up to pulling guns and putting it in people's heads. And we just asked the kids sort of, well, what's the typical way people have? And with this group of kids, they were all at boys' school. Their thermometers were pretty high. And we then began working to sort of incrementally lower those thermometers. But when you think about it, this kid was going to go out and parent. And his idea of what was acceptable parenting obviously was something we don't want. Something that we would identify as a sin, but actually was normal within his world. And so we really need to think of choice as within this context of how people are brought up. And frankly, a lot of them did not have the privileges that we did. You know, it never occurred to me as a child that I was going to be beaten. In fact, a strong look was probably pretty devastating to me until I became an adolescent, but then we won't go into details about that. So it's that circumstance. And I also think about those circumstances. We have something called betrayal traumas, which are different than other traumas. Betrayal traumas are when someone who loves you, should love you, does the trauma. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. And for many people who experience that betrayal trauma, their whole perception of relationships, what love is, what closeness is, what intimacy means, is very different, very, very different than someone who has been brought up in a stable, nurturing, loving home. And also know that people who have that experience, many of them really struggle with relationships. In fact, there's a name. We call it social thinning. And it's the process that because of the struggles with relationships, their social network thins out because they're having trouble having relationships with people. And in the most extreme cases, they become very socially isolated, which then aggravates the trauma symptoms, and it's really problematic. Where I work, we see a lot of those kids who are very isolated. They've been traumatized. They have no idea how to feel close to somebody. And they're really hard to do therapy with, because as soon as you get close to them, I know what you're going to do. It's sort of how they view the world. And so that trusting is really difficult. So once again, the choice is based on the context of what we live in. And there's many people who work very hard to try and deal with that context and make good decisions, and may not. And we have to be very, very careful about how we do judging at that point, because we may just not be understand. The other piece is we also have to be realistic. It's difficult. Sometimes it makes relationships difficult. Sometimes it makes relationships, it makes it very difficult to offer help through relationships. But I still think when you look at it, that's a stumbling block, and we all are responsible for trying to be of some assistance and some help in that process. And at least in my thinking, is to really avoid that concept of just a choice. Just a choice. You know, if I was applying that concept to everything I did between the ages of 15 and about 25, there's a pretty long list of really bad decisions that I did. You know, and in some ways, this also applies to ourselves, because sometimes we beat ourselves up pretty badly, saying, why did I make that choice? Why did I make that decision? And in fact, probably if we go back and think about it, and we look at our situation, there might have been some really good reasons why we made a really bad choice, just like other people. I sort of think about this in the terms of, does God grade on a curve? And you know, I really think God does. God understands context, and God understands that there's stumbling blocks. And maybe that's why God's forgiving, because God understands that. And the other piece that we really have to understand, at least it's clear to me in Scripture, and obviously that's my interpretation. I don't take it too seriously. But when you read from everyone who has given much, much will be, who have been given much, much will be demanded. That's a pretty straightforward statement, that when we have the privilege of certain things, certain upbringings, of certain positions, there's a bigger ask for us on those issues. So we really should reflect and inquire about how we define sin, how do we implement our reaction to sin, and think about that very carefully and understanding circumstances. Because our first priority should be to remove stumbling blocks for others, not to judge, and to understand that God's asked us to recognize those demands God has placed on us, not to create stumbling blocks. So I'm just going to read those 2 verses again as an ending. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And for the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. That's why I find the verse terrifying. It really gives us some clear direction. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother or sister's way.
Anybody have a song? Nothing. There's one playing in my head, but I can't say what the title is, so. No. Okay. This is it. Let's turn to 343.